All right, welcome. I'm Weston Wamp. Good afternoon to those of you who are with us here and those of you who are watching online, both in Texas and across the country. I'm Weston Wamp with the Millennial Debt Foundation, and here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation in Austin, we're launching our Stewardship series, which will give us the opportunity to travel across the country in 2021, having conversations that we think need to happen about the fiscal future of the country and the consequences of debt. You know, if you take a look at our country's history, just about any issue that gets attention in Washington first gets attention at a state level. And that's why we think it's important, even starting in a pandemic, to get out across the country and have these conversations outside of the Washington bubble. I want to say a quick thank you, obviously, to Texas Public Policy Foundation for opening up your doors and your team's help in putting this event together, and then to Americans for Prosperity, their Texas chapter, who's also one of our co-sponsors. And to our first guest, three quick panels here. I told you as we were getting started, when we had this idea and we got serious about scheduling, we thought it would really be appropriate to try to involve you, because you are, as the Texas Land Commissioner, one of the emerging fiscal conservatives across the country who doesn't have the opportunity just to talk in theory about what stewardship looks like. It's your job. And so we're grateful for you joining us.
It's great to be with you, Weston. Great to be with each and every one of you and those that are dialing in and watching.
Texas Land Commissioner George P. Bush. Now, in Tennessee, there is not a general land office. And I think this is important context for those who are watching across the country, because this is the oldest office going back to the Republic of Texas. And I think you could rename the Office of Stewardship, because from land to natural resources, even downstream into education here, the decisions you make end up having generational impact. Certainly could. So how do you handle that responsibility? I mean, you both are a politician who has to be elected, but you make decisions every day that could have significant consequences decades from now.
Well, really, you have to give credit to the forefathers of the Texas Republic that created the General Land Office, really to fund education, but help to balance future budgets, which historically we've been able to do. And with the discussion of federal ownership of Western states, I was just talking with my counterpart in Arizona, and where they have over 80% of their land controlled by the feds. And so when you look at the new Biden administration and the attacks on state ownership of whether it's mineral rights or states' rights, it's something that Texans don't appreciate, that less than 1% of our state's geography is controlled by the feds. And that was because the forefathers of the Republic constitutionally protected these lands that are in excess of 14 million acres. Texas was blessed with great oil deposits, arguably the greatest in North America. So we have benefited from that and have built an endowment now in excess of $32 billion, so roughly the size of the Harvard University endowment. We manage that with the State Board of Education, but all to benefit K through 12. The post-secondary educational institutes here in Texas have their own portfolio of 2 million acres in the Permian Basin, also building a multi-billion-dollar endowment. And so stewardship is at the core of the land office and what we do. Attracting new technologies, innovators, developers, whether it's the Elon Musks, the Joe Lonsdales of the world, to Texas to look at ways in which we can harness energy sources for tomorrow as well.
I heard you come from a political family. Is this right? So, and you've watched politics. I grew up involved in Tennessee politics. My father served in Congress for a period of time, and I think back on growing up in the '90s around pretty intense campaigns. You grew up obviously, with a front row seat to a lot of political campaigns. But if you go back and you think about your great grandfather and your grandfather, it feels like it was a different era in our politics, in the sense that everybody who's in elected office knew, just like they know now, that they would stand for re-election at some point. But it didn't feel like campaigns drove policy. How does the culture of our politics today, you think, affect the short-sightedness, what often feels like the short-sightedness of our policy, and how do you push back against that?
Well, I think it's more noticeable in Washington, D.C. There's no doubt about it. If my grandfather were here, he would share a story about how he would have a beer with Tip O'Neill, who is the famous liberal speaker at the time when he was in the U.S. Congress. But there was more camaraderie, and I think more of a personal relationship where deals could get done. Standing firm for your constituents and for your congressional districts, but at the same time, being able to go home to report that you've actually done something during your time in Congress. I'm not in Washington, D.C., nor do I have any aspirations to go to D.C. I can tell you the Texas experience is productive. That even though we control virtually all aspects of government here in Texas as conservatives, we've been able to work with Democrats to pass meaningful reforms that TPPF is a part of, and especially in the criminal justice space, which has been exciting to watch. And so I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. You know, our country has faced tremendous challenges historically, civil wars, world wars, now a pandemic. And so as a matter of necessity, I really feel like we're going to have to come together. Otherwise, there will be other disruptive political changes that will create new parties, new alliances, new coalitions that we're not even thinking about right now.
You mentioned innovators. You mentioned Lonsdale and Musk, and your position puts you in an interesting role to look into the future of Texas. When we think about fiscal issues, and particularly, you know, as these series of panels are themed, we think about them in a generational way. You know, I'm often curious that so many millennials find themselves extremely passionate about climate issues, for example, or environmental issues. And I'm sure you deal with them all the time and find a way to work with them. You know, you're a Republican, they may not be. But they're, at the end of the day, whether they realize it or not, they're interested in stewardship. They're questioning whether their parents and grandparents have left them in a position that they are comfortable with. Is there potentially some alignment that you see down the road? I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a stewardship guy. I might have to spend more of my time worried about the financial security of the country and of my home state. But is there, do you think there's a bridge there? Because we're talking at the end of the day about really the same principles.
I do. I mean, Texas Energy, I think, reflects that, where the days of this false narrative, particularly peddled by the left and the current White House, is, well, you can't develop a natural resource while protecting the environment at the same time. Whereas in Texas, we've done that for generations. You know, especially in renewables. This is a discussion that I see happening in the next generation, where we're talking about switching off of fossil fuels overnight. But when you bring these solar panels into urban environments, you impact residential and commercial development in fast-growing areas of Texas, which will result in environmentalists pushing back on the usage of renewable developments in urban areas. We've seen the largest offshore wind farm development just off the Texas coast that my predecessor signed at the office, but fell apart because environmentalist groups combined with the U.S. military and the chambers of commerce in the area to say that this is too much of an impact on the largest migratory bird pattern that you'll see in North America that comes up the Gulf of Mexico from South Padre Island. So, you know, finding that balance, I think, should be determined at the local level. I think that's the experience of Texas, not having Washington, D.C., you know, draft these top-down, bottom approaches to regulating virtually every aspect of how you lay out a solar grid farm or a wind panel, a wind farm development.
Yeah, well, what you're talking about there is some people act like it's an antiquated term, but I actually hope, and in fact, I think a lot of my efforts on a daily basis are in hopes that the future of America is federalism, which really would get us back to our roots. I mean, it's not all that long ago that we still would point to the 10th Amendment and say, shouldn't the federal government just do what it's supposed to do? Of course, I think if it would, it'd be a whole lot easier to pay the bills, so to speak. You know, with federalism in mind, when you, and in your role, you interact with the federal government more than you'd like to. So both as land commissioner, but then also as a grandson of one of the great Americans, when you look at Washington today in 2021, what do you think? What do you see?
I think it's horribly broken. I think it's drifted way too far from what the founders contemplated, which you alluded to in your prior remarks, and that relates to the Constitution. And the contemplation at the time when the drafters came together was to have a limited government that was focused on some very simple things, and to only be involved in the state's management of issues on a limited array. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in terms of interpretation of the Constitution, whether it's the 14th Amendment and other amendments that now neglect the 10th Amendment. Most school kids, including in Texas, when they come through, they don't learn about the 10th Amendment, nor do they learn about the 9th Amendment, which preserves individual rights that are that are not enumerated for the federal government. And so that's a problem, is the failure of civics in our country, the failure of civics in our high schools, whether it's here in Texas. And so I don't have an easy solution to what's happening in DC, but I do see a government that's run amok in terms of its power, in terms of its debt, that is now saddling future generations, sadly. And being a father of four and father of two, that's what I think about, is what kind of country are they going to inherit? And it's looking like it'll be a bankrupt one.
Yeah, I think that has been a theoretical, or as I told you before we got started, a talking point in Washington. We talk about kids and grandkids, and I'll probably come back around to this with some of our congressional guests, but that's beginning to feel more palpable, right? I mean, I don't say I'm worried about what the country will be like for my kids and grandkids just because I work on these issues. Like, genuinely, I have questions about what their life will look like at my age. I mean, if you just project out where we're headed, even in a rosy scenario, it's hard to imagine that with our type of debt load, the country is able to grow. And I mean, we can't even hardly imagine an America that doesn't have a growing economy. But look at Japan. I mean, there was once a time where you wouldn't have imagined a stagnated Japanese economy. You're a business guy. Speaking of business and economic growth, do you think part of what we see in Washington is a reflection just of an over-levered society? I mean, there's debt everywhere, and it's kind of creeped into all aspects of our life. I mean, this week the country's gotten a crash course in short selling, whether they had any awareness before, and they realize you can lever to do that. And we have credit card debt and historic student loan debt. Is some of what's going on in Washington, I mean, this is maybe the answer here might be more hopeless than hopeful, but is it a reflection of culture and society?
Well, I don't think there's, unlike the private sector, a correlation, but in terms of incentives and being successful. So a member of Congress, if they had their salary docked until they could balance a budget, that would ensure that things get done. I know Senator Graham, is a friend of TPPF, attempted a constitutional amendment on balancing budgets. In our state legislature, they will have to balance a budget before we sign a dying gavel out of our session. Having those constitutional rail guards would be a first step, but how about docking congressional pay? Figuring out ways to financially incentivize the servants that we elect to represent us to do the work, to rein this thing in. And look, we all know that we can't rein in 30 trillion overnight. It would have to be a progressive way in which we phase this in, or look at entitlement reforms to, for example, maybe raise the expectancy age for Social Security repayments, or index measuring Medicare, Medicaid, and thinking about this and piecemealing it out, say, as Speaker Ryan attempted to do in his public service. But there's ways to do this. And I think that we need to comprehensively think about that. And I don't know if it's term limits, I don't know if it's docking pay, but whenever we see these types of ideas, I'm all in on it, because in the private sector, that would be unacceptable. If they were leading a business, or if they were VC investors in early stage businesses, they'd be out of a job.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's no question that it feels like a different paradigm. I've found that a lot of times the people across the country who are the angriest with the way that Washington spends money are people who are in state, actually serve in state legislatures or in state government, where they know the rules are different and tough decisions always have to be made. Your dad did this in the state of Florida to quite a bit of success. And in Washington, I think that's a principle that I'm curious about. Just the business person you speak, when you begin talking specifics like that, you speak as somebody whose actions have consequences. I mean, a lot of times in Congress, there's not a whole lot happening, and if you're in the minority, as conservatives have been for a period of time, your actions won't necessarily, your words don't necessarily lead to actions. What do you think tangibly, what can Washington learn from Texas? What can Washington learn from the way that states work? I mean, a balanced budget amendment would be ideal, but the truth is, in the new era, it is possible that the Biden administration runs $2 trillion deficit. So I don't know that we're structurally going to be able to be serious about a balanced budget, but what lessons can be learned?
Well, in Texas, as you touched on, we are a citizen legislature. So they actually have to live under the laws that they pass. And so when there's less government, typically you get better policy. So they, for the most part, they will be here for 5 months, and unless there's specials, which there may be this session with redistricting, but putting that aside for a second, they do return to their communities. And a lot of them are business owners. The percentage, I will say this, in terms of lawyers and lobbyists, and you count them versus business owners, doctors, I'm a lawyer, so I can say that, people who actually add value to society, I bet you it's a higher percentage in state legislatures that that are actually drafting these laws. You know, I think DC could also learn from the ideas of having a prosperous state. So this budget, for example, when California is talking about a $50 billion shortfall, and that's an annual budget, New York is looking at a $15 billion shortfall. We're looking at only at $1 billion. And so in terms of the sacrifices that we have to currently make, and then for sure over the long term, pale in comparison to what blue states are facing. And many of them, as we're seeing with Joe Lonsdale and Elon Musk, HP and Oracle, just in 1 week or a few weeks earlier this fall, a lot of these companies are coming here. One of my favorite parts of the job is talking with the CEO. Recently, I talked with one out of Illinois, large publicly held company. He says it's not a question of if I'm moving to Texas, it's a question of when. And it's probably going to be in the next few years. And so, you know, it's capital investment opportunity. It flows to almost like a water on a road. It's going to go to the lowest price point available. And Texas has rightfully positioned itself at one point almost like our country used to be. And so, so we've just got to fight for those values across the country, and hopefully we can have some success in DC.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about, there's been this trend that's played out over the last year, and I think there's not two cities in the country that have benefited from it more than Austin, Texas, and Nashville, Tennessee. So we're a Tennessee-based organization, and whether Washington wants to acknowledge it or not, I mean, it's one of the reasons that we wanted to start this series here. The future of America is in Texas and Tennessee and places like it, you know, not just those places. I think Miami's proven to be one of those places, but it's not there. And these conversations need to take place again, I think, outside of that bubble. All right, let's talk specifically about your office. You became the Texas Land Commissioner and you shrank the office. Why shrink the office? Isn't it cool to have a big staff and to be an important guy? Why would you make it smaller?
Well, the story I like to share is that my predecessor had 6 assistants and 2 people checking his mail. I don't care who you are, you can handle everything on this. So, you know, if you extrapolate that to an agency of 800 people, we did a whole scale audit from top down, and we found a lot of waste. And if you extrapolate that even to a larger scale at the federal level, we could do so much more. I felt like we needed to run it like a business. I campaigned like that. We actually implemented zero-based budgeting. Staff would push back and say, you can't do that in public government, but we were able to do that by actually forcing our decision makers in the agency to say, you know what, you've got to actually justify each line item in your budget every year. You can't just, you know, take it to the bank that we passed your budget one year and you can go to the next year and then add for inflation. So I think it's succeeded, you know, and with the pandemic, we've moved entirely digitally. Our staff is hungry. We're able to reward them almost like the private sector. You're able to keep your higher performers and perhaps let go those that are underperforming, help them find and pursue their personal and professional pursuits. But government deserves to operate like a business. And so I hope other agencies would follow that. If we could do that more, I think government could be more responsive.
Speaking of operating like a business, in our last minute, you know, Jeff Bezos and others, but he pretty famously talked about this at Amazon from the early days, that frugality would drive innovation. If you had less, you'd get more creative. I do find it painfully ironic that government, especially in Washington, operates the other way. We've got a problem, throw money at it. I mean, is that part of your experience as you guys have actually tried to tighten the belt, shrink the team, that frugality makes the team better?
Well, one thing we did at the agency is leverage technology. So since we do manage about 4 million acres of oil and gas producing assets, we used to require companies from ExxonMobil to the mom and pop oil companies to come physically to the Stephen F. Austin and submit a sealed envelope for their bids. We moved online with energynet.com and we've digitized the practice. We have people from Singapore bidding on Texas minerals, and we've obtained 20x more per acre than we did under traditional processes. And You should have seen the old process. We'd have 20 accountants counting and tallying every single one of these bids. It was something from the last century, and so government is antiquated in so many different areas. One thing we could do at the federal level, what President Trump did rightfully in one of his first acts, was to say we need civil service reform. The chief executive of the United States of America should be able to hire and fire folks as he or she should see fit, and allow that executive to run more like a business.
Commissioner, thank you. We'll leave it there. Our next 2 minutes from now, if you'll give us we're not going anywhere. We're just going to shift the stage around. TPPF's Executive Director, Kevin Roberts, and Congressman Chip Roy are going to join me for a conversation about how Texans can be involved in the push to make Washington more responsible. Thanks. Really. All right, welcome back. We rearranged. I backed up. I brought two brothers in here for the next conversation.
I'll take that compliment, Weston Wamp.
Congressman Chip Roy, and of course, the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Kevin Roberts. You need no introduction on this stage, but I feel honored to be introducing you.
Well, the honor's ours. Welcome to TPPF, and thanks for having me on the panel.
I'll say this before I ask the first question of the congressman. I'll say that in your freshman term, you were prolific, not just as a fiscal conservative, but as a legislator. You've been around the block, but your willingness to work across the aisle, when members of Congress are truly principled, they do that. I want to pay you the highest compliment that I can pay anybody who serves in Congress. I grew up at the feet of the late U.S. Senator Dr. Tom Coburn, who was really my mentor. And I started paying attention to you early in your freshman term because you remind me of Dr. Coburn. And I mean that in the most heartfelt way. You're principled, but you're kind. You're willing to admit when you've made a mistake. And those are, I think, all principles that we need more of, qualities we need more of in Washington. All right, so the first question is yours, Congressman. About a decade ago, the Tea Party, business groups, Chamber of Commerce, you name it. There was just about anybody who scanned center right in American politics made a lot of noise about the national debt. It's $18 or so trillion ago. Why should Texans care? I mean, you've seen the memes of Jerome Powell and the money maker. My favorite meme on Twitter is, you just print more money, can't you?
Well, first of all, thanks for hosting this event. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I think some of you might know my lovely bride contracted the coronavirus. I've not tested positive, but I'm keeping myself separated. So I appreciate being able to do it remotely, although I'd rather be there in person. So that way we can have two bald guys on the stage, right, Kevin? But you started this by comparing me to Dr. Tom Coburn, and I don't deserve that. He's one of the one of my most favorite people that I've ever worked with in public service. He was on the Senate Judiciary Committee when I worked for Senator John Cornyn, and then again for Senator Ted Cruz. He was a friend. I miss him dearly, and his staff have all been longtime friends of mine. So to even have that kind of comparison for someone who's a good human being and fighting to change Washington for the better, I really appreciate. You rightfully raised the question. I think when I went to Washington as a staffer, it was about $3 trillion of total debt. Now we're sitting at an astounding 28 trillion. And it really is a problem. It's now becoming a problem in and of itself, the weight of the debt, right? We are now barreling towards numbers that are so potentially insurmountable that we've got a real problem as a country. And I think we need to take a step back and realize that. When we have the equivalent amount of debt that we have today, that is the same amount of debt compared to GDP, the only time we've ever had that in our country was right after World War II, as you know. And that was as a result of saving the world from fascism. Now we have it because of irresponsible spending and the weight and the continuing added up of what we're seeing with, in so-called entitlement spending, right? And so this is something we've got to address directly. You asked the question, do people care? I spent my first 2 years on the House Budget Committee, and I would tell you that unfortunately, I don't think people care nearly enough. Both what happens is each side, if you will, Republicans get in their corner saying we need defense spending. Democrats get in their corner saying we need non-defense discretionary spending. And then everybody blames entitlements, mandatory spending, and then never do anything about it. And we've got to change that culture. Commissioner Bush, who's a good friend, he was a law school classmate of mine, raised a number of different ideas. I can get into those in a minute. I actually agree that we need some structural change, and I have some ideas that I'm happy to get into with you in a minute. But we do need some structural change in order to force the issue in Washington, because right now everybody's either actually embracing modern monetary theory, which is garbage, or they're just ignoring it. It's one of the two or both. And we can't do it any longer for a number of reasons.
You're right. I don't know that it might take multiple hours to get into it, but I do think in some ways in Washington, it's now binary. You either adhere to modern monetary theory or the rules of gravity as have applied for centuries. Kevin, you've got 4 kids. Is that right?
That is correct.
I've got a 4th on the way.
Congratulations.
Here's a concern I've got about conservatism broadly, and I think it applies here. It's pretty easy these days to own the libs, as the young conservatives will say. And there's a lot of energy, I think, in that vein of the conservative movement. Our highest calling is actually to conserve Texas, to conserve Tennessee, conserve the republic, conserve the country. That's not sexy, requires tough decisions. Are we headed there? Can we get back there? I think we're doing some soul searching as conservatives right now.
Excellent question, Weston. Thank you. The answer is yes. I think that the silver lining to the difficult several weeks we've all experienced, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, liberal, conservative, this has been a tough time in American history, is that we're looking for solutions. And for people who would describe themselves as center right or conservative or libertarian, the solution is federalism. And I'm a Burkean guy, a big fan of this late historian named Russell Kirk, who said that conservatism starts in our communities. It starts with being dads and husbands, with brothers, with neighbors, even if your neighbor has a political sign that's different than the guy you might vote for. And that's where, in building those good relationships, we can build civil society, which leads us to, this is the point, local and state focus. That's why what this organization is focused on, 80% of our work is focused on 2 blocks north, not just because we know Texas is the best state in the union, just ahead of Tennessee.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
But
We'll-
also because we know that whether it's Texas, Tennessee, or for that matter, Rhode Island or California, we want people there exercising their rights for good policy reforms there so that people like Congressman Roy can have good ideas to borrow from.
Congressman, we'll get to what some of the solutions are, but I have a hunch that on this side of the equation in Texas, part of this is about sending the right people to Washington. Dr. Coburn would often really summarize it this way, and he'd say that just about everybody who serves into Congress falls into one of two pretty simple categories to understand. You're either a public servant or you're a politician, and he'd define it as, and it is pretty easy to tell, you're either consumed by reelection, you're always focused on that, or you are in the public service category and you hold the job loosely and you're willing to do the right thing, even if it means coming back to Texas and explaining to people who are mad at you why you did what you did for the good of the country long term. I believe you're one of those guys. I think you've demonstrated that in your first couple of years. I think we've got a profound question. It's not just a Texas question, but this delegation is particularly influential. How do we go about recruiting more people who don't want to become careerists in Washington, but are willing to go there, do the tough things, come back home and explain why?
Well, it's a great question, and you're right. I think that's fundamentally important that you not be spending your time in Washington always focused on reelection. One of the things that frustrated me the most in November when I first got elected in 2018 was the very first 3 weeks of conversations in Washington. It wasn't about how House Republicans just lost the majority. It wasn't soul searching about figuring out what we need to do to better reflect the interests of the American people, but it was about how are we going to get back in power? What are we going to do to raise money? What are we going to do to combat, Act Blue? And look, those are all important questions to talk about. I get that, but the bottom line is you need to be able to win the minds and hearts of the American people. Kevin just talked about federalism, right? It's always a kind of a wonky phrase or expression. I spent a great part of my career focused on federalism, whether it was working in the Senate as a staffer and for Ted Cruz, or whether it was working for TPPF, working on the 10th Amendment issues there. I fundamentally believe in it. A couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to merge the federalism points from Kevin and what you just asked. When I was on the floor of the House of Representatives, I chose to not object to the electors. That was something that obviously raised some flags among some of our more conservative based supporters. And I don't mean to get into the debate about that here, but what I said on the floor of the House of Representatives when I did that was, and I took 5 minutes, I got a block of time, and I explained how, in my view, we have got to find our way to agree to disagree. And I put it in the context. I outlined a sort of train of abuses, if you will, to use the phrasing of the declaration, of the things the federal government are doing, and that the insertion of Congress and, more importantly, executive branch officials and bureaucrats into our lives and how it's a problem, and the litany of things that concern us as conservatives on education, on spending, on border security, on guns, on free speech, on religion, on life, and go down that list. This is because Washington is doing things it's not supposed to do. And if we want to make this country united again, to stand up front China, to stand up and have a strong military, to have a strong economy for our kids and grandkids, then we have to agree to disagree under federalism. We have to let California be California, let Texas be Texas, let Tennessee be Tennessee. That's how we make this work. That's how we get back to being the United States. And that's the only path forward, in my view, that doesn't result in continued strain and continued conflict. And I said that in the context of the electors. Again, wherever you landed on that, my perspective was we need to accept the electors from the states as a part of our structural system of federalism, where we, Congress, respect what the states send us. Now, we can have a debate about election reform and all of that, but that's what drives me every single day. And it's critically important that you speak the truth and stand up for what you believe in. I took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. My interpretation of that told me that that was the right course of action. So I needed to pursue it regardless of politics.
Well, that's the kind of consistency that I was talking about when I introduced you. I don't think people realize, or they may not realize, how sincere Tennesseans and Texans are when we talk about federalism and we say California can do what they want to do. I think we'll reap the rewards for those policy, but we're more than willing to engage in a competition of ideas, aren't we? I mean, the living laboratories of freedom are the ideas of the states. And I think we're more than happy to compete. What we don't want is for our ability to do so to be infringed by a federal government that just ever so slightly every year seems to do more and more and more. but it's hard. And I recognize, Congressman, that it's hard. So Kevin, the question is, when progressives, frankly, are, if you were running a think tank that was advocating progressive policies, you'd be offering all sorts of freebies to the crowd. That's not that hard to sell. I'm giving you, it's sort of like Oprah back in the day, and you get that, and you get that. But for conservatives, it's a tougher sell if we're really working and operating on principle. How do we give courage to the Chip Roys in Washington to do the right thing? Congressman Crenshaw talks about this a lot. We got to have their back to make tough decisions, not the ones that are fun.
I'd say three things to the great question you posed. The first is what Chip just said, which is understanding what federalism is. And for those of us who call ourselves conservatives, be just as comfortable with California making its decisions as we are with Texas doing it or Tennessee doing it. The second thing is to understand that while we always have a command of the facts and logic, we have to put those in perspective for people. Here at Texas Public Policy Foundation, we always try to put a human face on that data. So for example, it's important to note that by the end of this calendar year, the national debt will be over $30 trillion. It's important to note that just this year, the deficit will be over $3 trillion. It's important to note that the interest on the debt this year will be $350 billion. But we have to put those in perspective. So you've got 4 kids, or fourth on the way. I have 4 kids. You take the interest on the debt. This is just paying the interest, like paying the minimum due on your credit card. And for every single American, that's $1,100 a year. That's a gallon of milk a day, brother. I've got 4 kids. We drink a lot of milk, but we don't pay for a gallon of milk a day. And that's with interest rates at historic lows. That kind of framing and using faces and people and families who are affected by that will lead us to the third thing, which is to give our people specific action steps of how they can be involved. A lot of people, last point quickly, want to put their nose in the corner because of what happened on the Capitol on January 6th. Reprehensible. That's what the left wants us to do. I battled them for 20 years in academia. Now is the time to resist our urge to be apathetic and to be passionate about fixing these problems and give these good guys some support.
I love that you mentioned interest, because I'm going to come to you, Congressman, with a kind of final question about what it is that Texans can latch on to and advocate for. But I'm going to take a moment to just give an example, and I'll give credit to Brian Riedel at the Manhattan Institute, because he always talks about this. When we think about interest rates, and often you'll hear, oh, borrow what you want, the rates are low. First of all, we finance most of our federal debt short term. So it's going to have to be refinanced for all the young people in the crowd multiple times in our lifetime. That's the first thing to remember. But when you think about 30 trillion, we may hit 30 trillion in debt by the end of February, but that's a round number for us to work with. We pay about 1.7% across all federal debt in terms of an interest rate. Let's just say a decade from now, of course, the debt will be a lot higher a decade from now, but let's just say tomorrow rates went up 1 percentage point. We're paying an average of 2.7%. Well, it's pretty easy to calculate. That's 1% of $30 trillion. That's $300 billion. You fast forward a decade from now where we may have $50 trillion in debt, and you realize interest alone, and there are morality questions and certainly questions of stewardship that apply here, but there are also just some cold, hard financial realities. So, Congressman, the question that we'll wrap up with is this. You've been around Capitol Hill in a lot of different roles. You're now becoming, I think, one of the respected fiscal conservatives on Capitol Hill. Clean slate, you're the Speaker of the House. The country's on a crash course, I believe, in terms of fiscal policy. What do we do to rectify that?
Well, it's a great question. And I think this is the last question. I'll try to wrap up with a couple thoughts. One, you asked me about how you get better people to represent Texans, and I didn't quite get to that answer. I would say elect people, run people who have a track record of success and a proven track record of conservatism. For example, my friend Kevin Roberts, I have no idea if he ever wants to run for office, but if he did, you know full well where he's coming from. He has a track record of standing up for conservatism. We need people like that, people you know where they're going to be when the fight comes at us. The second thing is, I agree completely with Kevin that you have to put in perspective the amount of debt, put it in the perspective of what it means to a family. Here's another way to look at it. If you set out to count to 28 trillion right now, one Mississippi, one per second, it would take you 887,000 years to get to 28 trillion. People just don't understand the magnitude of that debt. The third point is that debt, the total amount, isn't really the actual problem, even though now increasingly it is becoming the problem. The real problem is we never sit down and make the tough decisions at the table because we're not forced to, as Texas is under a balanced budget requirement. We're never forced to make tough choices between spending money for the NEA or defense, or what to do about entitlement spending, or what to do about education spending. We just write blank checks. We just keep spending money. That means you make bad policy choices because you've got an infinite supply of money, allegedly. You really don't. And now you just go write a blank check. Defense hawks do it. So do big spending, non-defense discretionary folks. We need to be serious about it, roll our sleeves up, and make the tough choices like you do as a family. Final point, make Washington more like Texas. Now, look, that's a throwaway line, right? Easy for us Texans to say. Maybe more like Tennessee. What do I mean by that? I like that in Texas, we meet every other year, and we do so for, 5 months. We need a little bit more of that in Washington. I would go to biennial budgeting. I would make it to where we're only focused on a 2-year cycle, and I would make it to where we can't raise money for the first 6 months when we come in, just like in Texas. They come in, they can't raise money. They got to go do the session, pass a budget, get it done, sine die, and get out. I think we need essentially in Congress something like an appropriation spending cycle where we come in and for the first 4 or 5 months, we do our job and we work towards a balanced budget. We should balance it. And right now, we would just take anything like a 10-year path to balance. And we need to get in there, do it, do our job, and then go do the work over that people are going to do, raising money and stuff about reelection. I think you need to change those incentives. George mentioned attaching pay to it. Those are some decent ideas as well. There are some amendments to the Constitution that say how you can do that and when, but my bottom line is we need to structurally change it so that we're incentivized to go there and do the hard work that every business and American family has to do.
Congressman, thank you. Best to your wife. Thanks for joining us despite the circumstances. Kevin, obviously, thank you again for having us here. You're awesome. If you run for office one day,
I have the best job in the world.
To Texas.
I have the best job in the world right here. Thanks.
I love it. All right, one more transition. We're going to come back for a panel I don't think you want to miss. We'll call it the Young Guns, Congressman Dan Crenshaw, and a young policy star from Stand Together. We'll be right back. All right, for our third and final panel of the first in our stewardship series, we're going to talk about the generational implications. We're going to talk about the generational role, I think, of millennials in Congress and where there might be some opportunities even to work across the aisle on these long-term issues. And I'm joined by Stand Together's Vice President of Economic Initiatives, Economic Opportunity, Akash Chougule, and probably the most recognizable young conservative in the country, Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw. Thanks, guys. Congressman, I'm going to start with you. You're 2 years in. You're not a freshman anymore. You've, I don't know whether you're more optimistic or more cynical, but you're now weathered in the storm. And I've appreciated the way that you seem to look to the psychology of what's happening and trying to understand at a deep level how Congress works and how your peers and colleagues think. I don't believe there's a Republican or a Democrat, or not more than maybe a handful, who really want the country to be at a 200% debt to GDP ratio in 2050, like CBO says we will. But boy, we are full speed ahead. Damn the torpedoes headed in that direction. Why do you think that is? Just you have some psychological insight 2 years into your service?
Yeah, I think that's actually the right question. Is what's the psychology of it? Because, yeah, look, if you just ask somebody, do you think it's good to have 200% debt to GDP ratio? They'll instinctively say, well, no. What do you want to do about it? Well, I want Congress to stop wasting money. Well, what do you want them to stop wasting money on? What do you think they're wasting money on? What is where does our debt really come from? What people don't want to hear is that it comes from mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They don't want to hear that. And so they say, well, the only reason that's even a problem is because Congress or the federal government, basically stashed that money and spent it on other things. This is a kind of a myth that we could get into on the trust fund, how the trust fund accounting actually happens. But the reality is this, the psychology of it is this, people still overwhelmingly clamor for action, and they live under this general falsehood that government is there to solve all your problems. So as long as we still believe that basic baseline, you're going to have a debt problem. Because people sort of casually say they want to solve the debt problem, but not the stuff that benefits them. And so you're always going to have this problem, which I think why we have to consider, which is why I support and consider a constitutional amendment on a balanced budget amendment. Now, how exactly that works out technically is a more interesting discussion. Maybe copying the some other countries and how they've done it, say Switzerland, Germany, and basically tying our spending to economic output. You could run deficits every year and actually still get us on a sound fiscal trajectory, as long as those deficits don't outpace GDP growth. So, there's ways to do this, common sense ways, but that psychology is the most important obstacle to getting this done. And we've got to change the culture, and then we can change the policy.
Well, a quick follow-up, and Akash will come to you after this, but the follow-up is, and this is why I've started with a psychology question, because these issues, like we talked with Congressman Roy, they're fraught. They're not fun things for you to come back in a re-election campaign and talk about the tough decisions that need to be made. But at the same time, like I saw you tweet about sending checks to fully employed people, right? I mean, I've got a whole lot of friends in Tennessee. My grandparents are on Social Security. They all got checks from the government, but they're not allowed to leave their house. So you're saying those things. Those are common sense, but there's a lot of Republicans even who say, oh, the government ought to, kind of a populist message, the government ought to send everybody money and level the playing field. So you're taking some of those risks. You're saying things that aren't inherently populist. Why aren't others who would acknowledge, again, 200% debt to GDP, where we're headed? That's not good, but they're not even acknowledging that the small wins that we should be able to agree on.
Well, populism is essentially telling people what they want to hear instead of telling people the truth. And who would have known, who would have thought that it's actually popular to send people free money? I just can't believe that's a popular thing. And I'm aghast at how many conservatives, and this is because Trump supported it, how many conservatives just so quickly and instinctively started to say, right, that's my money, I've earned it. What are you talking about? Like, what that is not a conservative principle or even close to it. And it's unsustainable. You're effectively giving in to one of the left's greatest claims on universal basic income. And we know from both experience, this has been tried around the world, this does not work. It encourages people not to work. It encourages people to be less productive. It is morally wrong, frankly, to give people things that they have not earned in any way, shape, or form. I realize that it doesn't feel compassionate, but it's true. And look, I think a lot of the conservatives were just airing their grievances, to be perfectly honest. They're mad about the lockdowns. They're mad about foreign aid spending, even though there's a lot more context to that than people would have liked to believe. But look, part of leadership is telling people uncomfortable truths, and we have too many leaders on the Republican side who refuse to do that. I'm happy to be on the panel. It's always me and Chip on this TPPF things, and you can disagree with us, but we're not afraid to tell uncomfortable truths, and we have way too many colleagues that are, because those retweets are nice, man. They make you feel good. And it's fun to be a populist sometimes. You're never held accountable to anything true. You're never held accountable to actually govern, but you can say what makes people feel good, and that makes you feel good. So that's the psychology of it.
Yeah, well, there's a reason we only invited 2 Texas congressmen to be involved on the panel, and it's for that very reason. Akash, a question about where there might be opportunity moving forward in Washington. And maybe the better question is, where should there be, and why should there be opportunities to work across the aisle on these long-term questions of stewardship and sustainability? Because, for example, like Texas philanthropist John Arnold is among the moderate voices that posits that long-term, our deficit crisis actually will hurt poor Americans, certainly could hurt poor Americans more than corporate America, for example. But right now, I mean, this is not really a bipartisan set of issues.
No, that's exactly right. And I want to just get back to a point that Congressman Crenshaw made. I mean, it's not a coincidence that he and Congressman Roy are always the ones on these panels. I can't tell you, Weston, being here in the Washington area, having worked on the Hill previously, how refreshing it is to hear what both of these guys are saying. And particularly this point about populism, right? And what people want to hear versus what they need to hear, right? By all means, all spending should be on the table, right? Defense spending, foreign aid, all these little things. But at the end of the day, what is it that's driving our debt? Healthcare entitlements. So you talk about Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. You add in Social Security, and then our interest on the debt. Those 5 things alone account for 60% of all federal spending. And if you look at the direction that we're going and our projected growth in spending, those things account for 80% of the growth of all spending. Now, you talk about getting to solutions. I think from just sort of a rhetorical incentive basis, we have to change those incentives. Before we even get to what those solutions look like, there is almost no incentive for members of Congress to talk the way Congressman Crenshaw and Congressman Roy do. They're a rare case where they can make a credible claim to having been elected on a mandate to do something about federal spending and the debt. That's decreasingly the case. That might have been the case with the Tea Party wave 10 years ago. We have to start changing those incentives, not just in election cycles, but holding members of Congress accountable to making this a priority week in and week out, month in and month out, when there's 1,000 other things going on television every night. This is the problem that keeps getting worse. Now, what can we do about moving towards solutions? Because of the way the incentives are structured around these programs and around the media cycles, I don't think we're going to hit a home run on entitlement reform, right? On mandatory spending reform. We're not going to fix these things with one program. What we can do is start talking about incremental progress that moves us in the right direction, but isn't so much so that folks can say, oh, look, we touched it, it's over, we don't need to do anything else. But we also need to look at reforms that aren't going to feel like they're setting the world on fire. Because again, at the end of the day, the media narratives, all these special interest groups, for every Congressman Crenshaw there is, if we get to 218 and they're taking votes on this stuff, there's going to be a firestorm of, you're cutting Medicare benefits, Medicaid benefits, whatever the case may be. So what can we do to start moving in that direction that won't make people feel like their entire world is on fire just because by some miracle we get a critical mass of folks who want to touch these programs? That could be things as small, Weston, as tinkering with the way that we adjust cost of living adjustments and inflation, not even for current beneficiaries or anybody even close to being on these programs, but for people like you and me, the millennial generation, younger folks. Right now, the way these programs are headed, they're just not going to be there for us in their current form. And so we have no choice but to act. So let's act in a way that isn't going to create a huge firestorm, but can make these programs sustainable. Because you mentioned it, these programs, when they face the cuts that they will inevitably have to face, there are 19 or 20% cuts baked into the law in Social Security. The folks who are going to be hurt the most when those cuts come to bear are the folks who need these programs, who are poor Americans, not the rich.
Congressman, in your first term, you introduced a bill that I think is a good example of the kind of bill that would demonstrate to the American people that Congress was willing to clean up government and the way that, waste, fraud, and abuse, as they say, that might buy the kind of credibility where you could then enter bigger conversations that have greater long-term consequences like Medicare. Your bill, Congressman, Senator Coburn would talk a lot actually about the same problem that you're seeking to solve, where agencies go on this spending spree. It's crazy. At the end of the year, federal agencies go on this spending spree, and it's also that they can guarantee and lock in that their budget will be the same or larger the next year. Talk about that bill. Will you reintroduce it? Surely there's an appetite on the other side of the aisle for some just common sense solutions like that. And you're a member of the Budget Committee. What budget process reforms are most interesting to you? Have you paid attention to some of the recommendations, for example, of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress?
Yeah, the end of the year Fiscal Responsibility Act is what it's called. It's very simple. It's along the lines of what he just mentioned, which is like incremental things that don't piss anybody off, but have an effect that put us in the right direction. And it should be bipartisan. Didn't gain a lot of traction because the reality is the last 2 years, and unfortunately maybe these 2 years as well, are just there's just not a lot of appetite from Democrats to even work with us on anything. But look, that bill is very simple. It simply just tax that problem that you just mentioned, where if you've ever worked in federal government, this happens. The end of the year, you're worried that you won't get the same budget if you don't spend that last $10 million right now. And so that's how you end up with a bunch of more plasma TVs and crab leg dinners and all these things. And it just, this is the kind of thing that Americans are just sick of, right? Even if it doesn't have a huge effect on the budget over in the long term, it still feels like an injustice is happening, and they're absolutely correct. I mean, we don't want to see this kind of waste. It makes people are already pretty angry when they have to pay a bunch of taxes, but it makes them even angrier when they know that stuff is getting wasted.
Now, the follow-ups on the budget process, because, for example, Congressman Kilmer, going back to the last time with Paul Ryan that they tried to fix the budget process, he's been engaged in this work for a while, chairs the Modernization Select Committee that has laid out some solutions I've heard you talk about. Congressman Roy mentioned them. You're on the Budget Committee. We've got to make a budget, right? We've actually got to put a budget together in all likelihood before we can be serious about the programs that are on such an unsustainable path.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a silver bullet here. If there was, we'd be talking about it more. Again, I think truly the biggest problem, because look, the biggest problem isn't even discretionary spending. So, maybe reform should be that we at least have to address and budget for mandatory spending once every 5 years. Like, that would be a great new thing to do. But we can tinker with, the minibuses, the omnibuses, and the deadlines, and whether we're making it biennial budget cycle. We're just tinkering with it then. Like, I don't think these are huge changes, because in the end, the underlying cultural problem is really the problem, which is that Americans demand action. Whether, even the ones who claim to be conservative, they're still demanding their piece of the pie, and they're still demanding action. They still believe that government has left them behind, and their life would be better if government would do something. Well, every time you ask government to do something, that usually involves a bunch of money. And the way incentives work in Washington is, well, the most compassionate, the politician that cares the most is willing to double the funding on the program that you like the most. And that's how they get your votes. So until Americans stop basically allowing themselves to be bribed by opportunistic politicians that basically bribe you with more government spending and programs to get your vote, then this is never going to change. But some of the changes could be some of the things I just said. And again, like I said before, I support a balanced budget amendment too. And I don't think it has to be very draconian. It doesn't mean like zero deficits. Okay. What it can mean is that deficit is tied to economic output with some kind of formula, and that puts us on a sustainable trajectory. I mean, you can have debt forever. Okay, that's fine. But the question is, how much is that debt growing and at what pace? So again, we can do this if we actually cared about it and we're willing to educate people on what needs to be done.
This is a question for both of you, but Akash, and you can follow up as I ask this question too. But when we think about millennials in Congress, I've got some hope. I mean, certainly some of your better known millennials on the progressive side are not going to be interested in these issues. However, there is a general consensus, maybe short of just a small group of millennials, that we need better stewardship when it comes to the environment. And there's even a willingness, I sense, to sacrifice in order to put the country's environmental resources and our climate on if we can affect climate, then we ought to try. Is there some type of grand bargain, so to speak, where millennials say, let's work on fiscal stewardship, let's work on environmental stewardship?
I'm glad you brought up that example, Weston. I actually take a different lesson from the progress that the left has made on the issue of climate change, environmental stewardship. That issue is not terribly different than the national debt if you look at the way they've approached it, right? They've said it's like this huge existential threat, but you can't see it in your day-to-day life. What they've done a good job of is increasing the urgency and making people want to act on that issue, such that you now have people in both parties, across the political aisle, outside of politics, who say, yes, we need to do something about it, right? That's because of years and years and years and years of hammering away at the urgency of that issue. That's a model I think we can and should take on the national debt, exactly by making points like the one you made, which is that the people who will pay the price for not addressing the debt are the poorest Americans. And just to get back to your previous point about what can we do, we talked a little bit about tinkering around the edges of mandatory spending programs to start at least, moving the ball in that direction. Congressman Crenshaw talked about just sort of the year-to-year budget process that we have. There are a lot of great ideas for reform out there. We don't know if they're going to work because we don't know if they're going to be followed. We have a budget process right now that's been the law for 40 years, and we just haven't done it. I mean, I'm 31 years old. I think the last time Congress went through the full established regular order budget process, I might have been 10. I mean, it's been 20 plus years. A simple reform that I think both parties should be able to get behind, regardless of whether they disagree or agree about what government is spending on, is let's have those debates the manner in which they're supposed to be had. Those 12 appropriations bills, what is each agency spending on? How much money is there going to each agency for each program? We're simply not having those debates because we get to these must-pass situations. We need an omnibus, a continuing resolution, which then becomes a Christmas tree. It's either a shutdown or you pass this $1 trillion bill with a bunch of garbage laid into it. I think we can, one, really stress that we need to get back on regular budget order, which sounds wonky, but is a pretty important way to just make government feel like they're listening to you and your priorities. And then if and when we do get to these continuing resolution situations, which are really unfortunate, something as simple as an automatic CR, right? Where it's not additional spending. We're not automatically increasing spending levels just because Congress didn't do its job all year. Maintain current spending levels while they're having these debates. I mean, I think there are little things like that again, may not make a huge impact on the debt, but they can begin to change those incentives while, again, to Congressman Crenshaw's point, organizations like TPPF, Americans for Prosperity, and others have to hammer away at this cultural idea of people relying on government, and particularly conservatives latching onto it as well.
Congressman, we'll let you wrap it up, but is there a possibility? Do you sense, and this is not a 6-month question, but it's a 2, 3, 4-year question. Is there an opportunity to partner across the aisle and for millennials to say, okay, we're all going to be around for that 2050, 200% debt to GDP future that CBO projects. And also we'll meet you at the water's edge. Maybe there are some climate change issues we can work on together. Is that pie in the sky, or is there a debt to GDP target? We're at 100% now. Could we be reasonable and say, let's just commit to a trajectory and hold hands here, be Americans, and do tough things for the good of the country long term? Other countries, our adversaries, think generationally. We're thinking, it seems, increasingly just election cycle to election cycle.
Yeah, I want to be optimistic. It's a bit hard to. There's some Democrats that do acknowledge but it's dwindling because a lot more are more persuaded by modern monetary theory, and others just don't care, right? So, but some maybe understand that mandatory spending is what drives debt. And there's a plan by Democrats to make Social Security solvent, for instance. But the problem with that plan, and what millennials need to understand, is that plan taxes millennials to pay for what are actually increased benefits in Social Security. So it's not exact. I mean, it's an enormous tax increase, and tax increases, especially when it comes to payroll taxes, are going to happen to millennials because boomers are done working. You know, and what, again, going back to the cultural argument, the big problem here is that boomer socialism led to millennial socialism. Now, I would have liked it if millennials said, "Hey, boomers, all your socialist policies that you voted yourselves for the last few decades put us in this mess, and so now we're gonna clean it up." And say, like, look, you can't have this excessive growth in benefits year over year that eventually I have to get taxed for. Okay, I haven't even gotten to start my family yet. It's housing is expensive. It's more expensive than it was for you. Okay, education is more expensive for me than it was for you. Healthcare is more expensive for me than it was for you. Okay, even when you adjust for inflation, these are facts that the millennials have a good point on, right? Sometimes millennials get labeled as, like, you know, over complaining a lot, and they do. But there are some facts that are just fundamentally true. And so, you know, a little grace should be had there, but we can't let that boomer socialism lead to millennial socialism, because what millennials are saying is, fine, you got all your free stuff in retirement. Well, I want my free healthcare, my free housing, and my free education. This is unsustainable. And to Akash's point, it's like, yeah, you've got to help people understand why it's unsustainable. And that's, unfortunately, it's harder than climate change is, because it's easier to show people the Day After Tomorrow movie where, like, giant tidal waves are coming over them. That was not true, but at least there's something that people can visualize with climate change. It is a kind of a totally separate issue. You know, I don't think it's a grand bargain, because I don't think you need to spend a lot of money to deal with climate change. I think some small investments and good innovation are how you deal with climate change. That's a whole separate panel. So, you know, it's not necessarily the case that these two issues are connected or mutually exclusive. They're just issues that we just have to be honest about, and help millennials understand what the Democrats' plan is to deal with something like Social Security. And their plan is to tax the hell out of you, okay, when things are more expensive for you. So millennials, just trust me, you're voting for the wrong party.
Well, I think one way that we can begin to communicate with young Americans about these issues that might relate to climate issues is that there is certainly distrust among millennials that our parents and grandparents handled some things well. I think equal distrust that they've been good stewards financially would be helpful. And I think, you know, there's plenty of millennials that are skeptical of big institutions, and Wall Street bets, I guess, is an example of that. Guys, thank you. We'll leave it there. But grateful, Congressman, for you, for your time here. And Akash, thanks for your expertise. Folks, that's it. That's a wrap on the first of our stewardship series. If you want to be a part of what we're doing, millennialdebt.org is our website. We are going to Nashville, Tennessee next with the Beacon Center and the former governor of Tennessee. And by the end of March, we'll end up at the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Would love to have you involved. Thanks for joining us today.